So it's really nice to have you back, Bernard.
Well, it's a great honour. Thank you very much.
Really nice.
It's a nice to be here.
So let's start by talking, slightly unusually from last time, talking about the poems that, well, let's say we chose. So let's start by talking about the Iron Age boat. So could you say something about what you had in mind, where that poem arises from?
Well, I remember the moment that's described in the poem. We're just going to this place, which is a very beautiful place in the mountains behind Mill Street, County Cork, which is where I come from. That's the parish of Mill Street. And it's there's a small kind of lake under the mountain. There's a waterfall going into it, and the farmer who has the land next to the lake, perhaps 30 years ago, maybe even more, was reclaiming land by draining the area, and they with the JCB, whatever it was, they dug up an Iron Age boat, a log boat, at the trunk of a tree, with the boat hewn out of it, as in Robinson Crusoe, and it's been preserved by the bog boat. It dates to the 3rd century AD, something like that, and so just sort of responded to that. Really.
Right. I mean, what struck me about it, rereading it, is this refrain: "If you doubt." It brought to mind, Heaney's "the miraculous as we had known it."
Oh, yes.
That sense, because you never say "if you doubt" and believe what.
Yes.
But there's that refrain that comes 3 times: "if you doubt."
Yes.
Did you have Heaney's miraculous somewhere in mind, do you think?
Well, it's a poem I'm very aware of and very admiring of, so it might have been unconsciously there, I think, yes. There's also, in the same, that's in Heaney's book, Seeing Things, isn't it? Which is a great title for that kind of book. But there's also the poem in that book, which suddenly says, "Me waiting till nearly 50 to credit marvels," with the kind of background he had growing up in this kind of in this agricultural world in Northern Ireland. And the example he gives then is the tree clock of tin cans the tinkers made. This as a kind of marvel. Okay? But rather what you said at the beginning about the kind of human marvels, very specifically the marvel of reality, really, I suppose.
And Tir Conatus?
Tir Conatus, it's the phrase that's used in Aeneid Book 6, isn't it, when Aeneas meets Anchises, his father, in the afterlife, and tries 3 times to embrace him. I mean, it's a big theme with Virgil, and Dante too, and other people. When somebody with their earthly body goes into the afterlife and meets the spirit, the dead spirit of somebody that was dear to them. I mean, with Aeneas, it's both Creosa, his wife, book 2, and Anchises in book 6. And it says, "Ter Conatus," 3 times he tried to embrace them, but his arm just passed through the spirit, because there's nothing physical to embrace. So I'm just applying that, I suppose, to a situation that happened a lot in farms in my kind of Irish childhood, I think. Perhaps less so now, I'm not sure, but where, you get 2 siblings, sister and brother, 2 sisters or 2 brothers, farming together all their lives, and just keeping themselves very much to themselves. I always want to say at this point that, in this country people think that they're reserved and on their dignity a bit, but not by the standards of the people I grew up among. English people are very tactile and friendly, not by the standards of the Irish countryside, really. There's another Heaney echo there, actually, at the end of Heaney's poem called "The Call." It's about ringing up his friend Brian Friel, and Anne Friel, Brian Friel's wife, though she's not named in they're not named in the poem, but that's what it was apparently. She said, "I'll just run out and get him. The weather's nice," so he thought he'd do a bit of weeding, So Heaney's there with the phone thinking, and he hears the clocks ticking at the other end of the phone, 2 clocks for some reason. And he says, and it occurred to me, if it were nowadays, this is how death would summon every man, He wouldn't come along with a cloak and a scythe. He'd just ring up, So. And then the last line of the poem, another masterly last line, is, next thing he spoke, and I almost said I loved him. So it's a great point to throw at students to why doesn't he say he loved him? And the answer is because he's an Irish male. That's why. And they don't go around telling each other they love each other. So but if it was possible, he would.
It's a wonderful poem.
It is a great poem, yes. But then you have tactility, I suppose. Again, linking to what you said about the human, really.
I mean, the other thing that strikes me about it is just your learning and how you use learning in your poems. I mean, we'll come back to this perhaps, but I've been reading your introduction to reading Chaucer, and you describe Chaucer as you say there's no poet in the English language who carries so much learning so lightly. And I feel that, I was thinking reading Procne recently from the new collection, and it seems to be an ideal for you, carrying learning lightly.
Yes, insofar as I carry it at all. Yes, I mean, I think. But the great thing about the mythological stories, the classical stories, all stories, I suppose, is the way they seem to go on having meaning, in the different worlds they encounter, So there's a book by George Steiner called Antigone's, about how the Antigone story is reenacted, generation and generation, century after century, in different places. The conflict of kind of familial piety and legal rule, That's the fundamental story. But the way the stories, the stories you find in the great texts do kind of reenact themselves. And Chaucer is a great example, I think, because he does humanize everything. He's a great humanist, Chaucer, but he is a great classicist too.
And you seem to carry that instinct to sort of bring the classical into your experience.
Yes, well, I like to, and yes.
The answer is yes. Okay. The other thing the first thing that struck me rereading the poems is, I don't know quite how to put this, but you seem to me to have an instinct to both tell and not tell in the poetry.
Yes.
Like you have a strong instinct to say things and to tell stories, tell the truth, and that instinct seems to me to be intimate. And yet the poems themselves also have a strong instinct not to tell.
Yes.
There's even a poem, I think, about your mother where you asked the reader that you'd rather they weren't there.
Yes.
Yes. You said, I think it says, I'd rather you wait outside.
That's right. Yeah.
So that, and yet the poem itself is painfully intimate. But that it's almost as if the poems are created by this instinct to tell and not to tell.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's what I don't know whether you're saying something about that.
You're very much so. I mean, I think that's. I'm almost conscious of that. I think. I mean, I suppose in a way, the most painful or the most affecting things are the hardest things to say, aren't they? I mean, death being the obvious thing, and that's more about death. In formal terms, I mean, Terry Eagleton said an interesting thing about the typical modern poem. He says, he goes through its story, and there's a pulled punch in the last line. I think it's a very smart observation. I think that very often is true. I mean, that is the tendency not to make a meal out of the telling, so to speak. Just to not tell. But I think it has to do with the seriousness of the subject, really.
Yeah. It even seems to, I was thinking of it as almost an extreme tact, a kind of non-assertion. It's as if there's a struggle between wanting to assert and not wanting to assert.
Absolutely.
A sort of privacy and a publicness on this.
Yes, it's right back to the Irish male again, I think. I think that, that idea you don't want to be portentous, so everything's very understated, I mean, they say if you ask a Kerryman a question, he answers it with another question. Just when he says, is this true? And the Kerryman said, is that what they say? So I think there is the non-assertion has got a great kind of a great tradition to it, really.
I mean, sort of carrying on with that sort of thought that I had, which is also, there's also an instinct in your poems all the way through the poems, you know, looking at the Selected again and Farmer's Cross and the Caesars of Cullen Church, to go from the local to the global, or to go from the particular to the universal, universal to the grander word. But you know, I was thinking of vanishing points, for instance, in the selected poems and telegrams, which I really loved telegrams. There's sort of the short tragedy of it, but just this instinct you have to reach out to the beyond the scope of the poem, but again a sort of reluctance to do that as well.
Yes, I think that is the structure. I think really. I suppose I was just thinking it has to do with being a medievalist. I think. I mean, I think things like the Old English elegies, which I've talked about quite a lot, and translated one of them in Cullen Church, the Wanderer. What I like so much about them is that they begin with a narrative section and then draw a very clear kind of moral conclusion. You know, but the experience of reading them generally is that everybody says things like The Seafarer, the narrative description is wonderful, the evocation of the sea and the sea birds and so on is terrific, you know. And then you get this perhaps slightly more didactic bit tacked on to the end. And the last word of The Seafarer is Amen, for instance, you know. But I mean, I think the kind of paradox is that the superior bit plus the more didactic bit is a far greater poem than the narrative on its own would be. So I think the notion of drawing some kind of moral, ethical, I don't know, universal conclusion from the pieces of experience that poems are made up of.
You also seem sort of reluctant to do that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Because it is a grand claim, isn't it? I mean, to take our small pieces of experience and to find something very grand to be deduced from them. Remember an early poem ending by saying, "I wonder what he thought he was up to then." You know,
yes, I remember that.
You know, and also, I suppose you're handing over to the reader. You know, you're handing over the responsibility and the work of interpretation to the reader. Saying, what do you think this means?
Yes, very much so. Yes, this sense of slantness to the poetry, you know, to use that word. In a way, I've just put this a slightly different way, but the desire to get up close and step back.
Yes.
Like I was really struck by the poem in the Caesars of Cullen Church, the meeting in the small hours, which I couldn't decide was about your father or about Heaney. It's opposite the Heaney, the from Piers Plowman that you dedicate to Heaney.
Yes.
And I couldn't tell. It felt like your father again because of the smoking.
Yes.
Which went back to passive smoking and the weakness and gunpowder and so on. So I wanted it to be about your father, but so you feel that you sort of, I know this person, then I think actually it could be about Heaney.
Yes. I mean, Heaney dwells on his father out in that way, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. Yeah.
He says his journey to the afterlife will be to meet his father. That's what he says. Hence, Aeneid 6 and so on. But I think it was my father actually. You know, right? But I mean, the relationship is exactly, you know, as Heaney with his father.
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. But, there's a rather kind of acid essay by Edna Longley, who was a Northern Irish critic, a very good critic, but pretty. She subjects poems to rather kind of hard scrutinies, you know. And she wrote a poem about an essay about modern Irish male poets again, called "When Did You Last See Your Father?" And I think, you know, that's a neat point. Really. I mean, there are a lot of these encounters with fathers, in that genre, really.
Well, it is there is a sense of your poems being haunted by your father.
Yes.
I think there's a sense of quite a lot of haunting in the poem, but I wonder whether it might be nice to hear a bit about your father because he's such a presence in the poem.
Yes. But the crucial thing, I think, in a way, apart from what he was like, which was very, very likeable, I think. But he died young. He dropped dead when he was 52. I was with him at a football match. So that moment, it does.
How old were you then?
I was 16.
Right.
But that moment did kind of inform an awful lot of what I thought and kind of wrote and tried to write afterwards, I think. He was a farmer. He was an extremely reluctant farmer. He hated farming. And my mother was a teacher from Manchester. who married him in North Cork. And she did all the farming, with her history degree. She did all the work and all the organisation, and all the everything, really. But he did. That's the world he came from. But he drove around Cork and Kerry selling insurance, which he hated as well.
Well, do you think you know why? I mean, why does he haunt the poem so much? Interesting that here he is again.
Yes.
And for me, the smoking was the clue.
Yes.
And the worm of ash on his lapel.
I'm very astonished that you.
A little bit.
Contextuality. But yes. I ask, but it is just a kind of endless sort of mild mourning, really. I think it's come back again recently because my elder sister Margaret was diagnosed with cancer and died very quickly a couple of months ago, in October, and she was probably the person who was sort of most like him as well, I think. And so that brought it up, but it has been a kind of a theme through everything, I think, and of course there is a lot of the elegiac about it.
It slightly reminded me of, I was watching an interview recently with Auden. You remember he was on Parkinson.
Oh, yes.
He sort of sits in a maid with that terrible voice of it.
Yes.
Tempted to imitate, but it's very posh, but in that sort of rather quacking kind of way.
That's right.
Very unlikable voice. Anyway, he's asked what's the value of poetry, and he said some interesting things. But one of the things that struck me is he said, I think it's one of the primary ways to talk to the dead.
Yes.
And he said that I think a culture that doesn't talk to the dead is very unhealthy.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you think that
very
there's
much
something in that.
Absolutely. I mean, I just quoted that actually. I was saying to you that I'm trying to write the very short introduction to poetry, those little sort of books, and that's one of my significant quotations. That from Auden, and I think that's right. I mean, I think what does poetry fundamentally do? I mean, one of the things I think it does is to keep the lines of communication open to the dead, or to open them up, really. Adrian Rich says that too. I mean, I think that people write elegies not just, I think, to express regret for the loss of people in the world, but just to have some sort of sense of another kind of world, transcendence, I suppose your word, really.
Because it so easily gets psychologized, doesn't it? That it's really just a kind of mourning thing, and that perhaps if one had therapy, one could get rid of it.
Yes, quite.
Whereas perhaps it's got some much greater function.
Yes.
Speaking to the dead, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. Yes, and I think linking to you, Rich, what you said about the transcendent as well. I think. No, I think that's right. And there's an awful lot of it, isn't there? We think of how much of world poetry is taken up with. With the place of the dead.
Yeah, and how attractive it is.
Yes.
You do want to read it. Doesn't feel forbidding. It's attractive.
Yes, that's right. No, that's right. They're good company, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I think in one of the poems you say you're as ill at ease with the living as the dead, or something like that.
Yes, that's right. More so, I think. Yes, that's right. Yes. I think I was thinking, that's one called "Truly, Madly, Deeply."
Oh yes,
which is about this dead husband who comes back and haunts his wife, Julia Stevenson, I think, is it? Yeah. And she comes back from work and she's tired, and there he is, and his other spirit friends who just go to warm themselves in front of the fire, because it's cold where they are now, So she finally says, "No, look, please, just give me a break." So he does. He withdraw, but it's very human again.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that so many things that poems are haunted by, but they're very much haunted by poverty.
Yes.
the Din Biggs, for instance, in the Seasons of Cullen Church, you have this wonderful line, but you said, but even having so little, there was room for having less. Incredible sort of, just a one line about the sort of viciousness of poverty.
Yes.
But even having so little, there was room for having less.
Yes.
Well, why does poverty sort of haunt the poem so much?
I suppose maybe I feel strongly about it, perhaps, but there's also the epigraph to the book from Juvenal, who says, the worst thing about poverty is it's embarrassing. There are all kinds of other bad things about it as well, which is humiliating.
And did you know poverty when you were a child?
Oh, tremendously, yes. I mean, by the standards of the locality, we weren't particularly poor. I mean, my father was driving around Kerry with his car selling insurance, but in the 1950s in Ireland, which is the first decade I remember when I was very young, there was tremendous poverty, the economic war there. People, well, there are all kinds of instances of it. You could, but people didn't have enough to eat, weren't properly dressed. People went to school barefoot in the winter and things like that. So it was all around you really. It was unignorable, I think.
I mean, again, remember the function of poetry to remember, because I think particularly for us in the developed world, we can start to forget what poverty can be like.
Absolutely.
You might not be able to afford shoes, or you might not be able to eat, or so on.
What real poverty is.
What real poverty is like.
But of course we see it all the time, don't we?
Yes, on television.
On television, that's right. Yeah.
Then, of course, another theme I keep coming back to is this almost sort of Wordsworthian concern with the minor character, with the dispossessed, the displaced. I was thinking of the wonderful poem, The Fall in the Graveyard, for instance, from selected poems, and Down syndrome, and then Ballybeg Priory in the Seasons of Cullen Church. There's and the tinkers appear in I think around the campfire. A real feeling for people who are dispossessed, who are on the margins of things.
Yes. Heaney again, really. I mean, his later books were extremely strong on that. His great word for it was the unregarded. It's a very good word, I think. Not disregarded, because that becomes somewhat abstract, doesn't it? But unregarded, people who are taken for granted as not being of any great significance. I mean, one of his expressions for the world upside down, and the apocalyptic, in the Horace poem about 9/11. Is he says when everything is turned upside down, one of the instances that will be the unregarded will be regarded. So the poor will have their share, and so on. The world that is not recognised as the world we live in, really.
And then, of course, the other thing is the brutality in the poems.
Yes.
I was thinking, there's so many, like The Will, for instance. It's a sort of brutal poem, quite a short poem. The Will.
Yes.
Just so first line.
Yes.
And you allow it to do its thing. Well, I mean, the anti-pastoral, I suppose, and I mean, growing up in the countryside, you're absolutely surrounded by brutality of all kinds, really. And I suppose some kind of negative, necessary brutality. And farming is a very rough business, really. Look at battery farming, battery hens, and so on. I think it doesnn't change, really. But you can't really ignore the brutality, I think. I mean, the other thing I was thinking, rereading the poems, is reminding me of something that Penelope Fitzgerald said. She said that life is not important enough to be tragic and too serious to be comic.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
I thought that was really wonderful.
Yeah, it is,
that our lives are too small to be tragic in that great tradition of tragedy.
Yes.
But too serious to be comic. And I thought there was something of that spirit in your work.
Well, that links to what you're saying as well, doesn't it, about the reluctance to declaim, at the end of the poems, really, I think.
Yes,
the pulling back from the restoration, that's the too small to be tragic. Yes,
Because there's definitely humour in your poems alongside brutality and sadness. And
yes. I mean, I think those are you kind of said them already, those are the things that characterise maybe the kind of culture that I grew up amongst, really. I mean, I think, the agricultural community, but there are the things that were poverty-stricken, but kind of death-troubled somehow in various ways, but also humorous, really, great wits, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember when I interviewed you last time. You asked for the Yeats poem, and you were just saying how the wonderful use of the English language in Ireland.
Yes.
Just for the sake of it.
Yes. Well, I'm perhaps repeating myself, but I think that's right. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why poetry and learning generally, is likely carried, why it is highly regarded in communities like that. I think I'm not sure why it is, but it's the case. That people mind the books. It's a great thing, really. So that idea of the Irish. I mean, and perhaps it's because perhaps people in Ireland, to some degree, still use English with elements of the foreign language to it. And we're talking about difficulty earlier on. I mean, poetry should be kind of well formed and so on, but I think it should be to some degree difficult as well. It's a slightly unattractive observation, but I think there should be something to be reckoned with in a poem. I mean, it can be straightforward, simple entertainment too. But I think that the way, an extreme example is the way James Joyce uses the English language. It is pretty difficult. But nobody would say that it shouldn't be done like that, because it is adding some kind of weight to it. There's an excitement about the language, I think, and people are excited by language, excited by eloquence, really, and maybe to do with English. I mean, to some degree, not to nowadays, of course, to a very small degree, but to some degree, it is a learnt a foreign language, and historically in Ireland.
And you were saying before that sometimes people choose words because they like how it sounds.
Yes.
It goes well, I think, is the phrase.
Yes.
It goes well.
Yeah. I just remember in The Guardian today, somebody, that Rosanna Greenstreet's thing from The Guardian magazine, and the person who was being interviewed was asked what her favourite word was, and she said something very, I don't know what it was now. But it's very surprising. It was a word like plight, P-L-I-G-H-T. But it was that spirit of, words being thought to be interesting just for themselves, and not for their function.
Not for the function.
And I think poetry in Ireland maybe does do that, I think, to some extent. Muldoon is an example.
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that your poems does use that, but in quite a restrained way, doesn't it?
Yeah, simple.
I mean, Muldoon's use of elegance and wit and gorgeous rhyme and so on is a long way away from yours.
Yes. I mean, it's his language is, and it's wonderful. I love it. But it's language for the sake of language to a considerable extent. It's not it's not the language just being kind of functional or expressive. It's the sheer kind of excitement and exuberance of language itself.
And the sort of charm of it.
Yes.
The charm of it,
Yes.
I suppose the danger of that is it's not always very moving, because it's charming and exuberant.
Yes.
Does it touch you?
Yes. I mean, he's an interesting case, I think, because when he does go for the for the touching, he's absolutely wonderful at it. And there's a wonderful poem of his called The Fox. Again about another death of the father poem. And he says he dreamt that his father was a mushroom farmer, and he said he dreamt that he came upon in the middle of the night, writing, just scribbling on the cover of a box with mushrooms in it, and he says to his son, go back to bed. It's only young dog fox. It is a tremendous kind of touch, and he does do that.
Yes, he does. That's true.
Yeah. And the fact that he doesn't do it normally makes it kind of stand out.
Makes it stronger, makes it stronger.
Yeah.
So, sort of drawing to a close, but I was reading a recent interview in the London magazine that you gave, and you say in that interview, our condition is too serious for jokes at the moment.
Yes.
And I sort of wonder what you had particularly in mind, and I was wondering how poetry might help.
Yes, that's the great question, isn't it? I mean, Alden's saying that poetry makes nothing happen, But Heaney, like Milosz, and people say, poetry must be strong enough to help, Milosz says, what's the good of a poem that can't stop a tank, in 1942. But how can it help? That's the big question, really. What is it?
How has it helped you, do you think?
Well, I suppose the idea of things being too serious. When I said before, that poetry should be difficult, I suppose what I really mean is poetry should be serious, really. I think ultimately. I mean, it can be funny, it can have wit and lightness and all kinds of things in it. But it has to be fundamentally serious, I think, really. We were talking before about David Constantine's book on poetry.
It was a wonderful book,
last year. It's a marvellous book, and I think it's the great short book on poetry recently. And it's utterly serious about. He believes that poetry should be political. That poetry can't ignore the real world, the outside world, the political world.
I remember him saying to me, it needs to be about something.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
it can't just be like a lyrical moment. It needs to be about something.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. Lots of people. C.D. Lewis said that. The less likely person to find saying it, but he said, personally, this is his very urbane style. He says, personally, I have a preference for poems that are about something. So I think it's a nice way of putting it as well.
Very elegant way of putting it.
But yeah, I mean, I think that things are pretty serious, aren't they? Really, I think one way or another. The instances that are kind of obvious, really, in the current world. But perhaps people have always felt that. That's been sure.
And there's always probably a time where it felt like it was easier.
Yes, yes, I think probably too. Yes.
Who knows? Who knows? And then again in that interview, you say the object of poetry really is to represent life, which is true for all times. Sorry, for all contexts.
Yes.
And that's what struck me reading the poems. I was reading the title poem, The Seasons of Cullen Church, and I didn't have a rural Catholic upbringing, but reading that poem made me feel like I did somehow. It's a very odd experience. It's like, oh yes, I know that. Yes. But I didn't. Literally, and yet there's a sense of I did know that.
Very pleased. Yes. It's about the Catholic upbringing, serving Mass and all that kind of thing. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And do you try when you write consciously to have that effect, as it were, on me, the reader, or do you hope?
I think. I mean, it doesn't. As you know yourself. I mean, from what you write yourself, you're in that vein too. But I think that you know those moments when it just works. The last line suddenly sort of works, and you kind of fling the pencil into the corner of the room. It's very unusual, but it does happen sometimes. When you feel that it's exactly the kind of contact I was trying to make. You only connect.
Yes, only connect. Yeah. And why do you think we should read poetry? I mean, one of the things I try to do with poetry is try to interest people in poetry. It's sort of a dying form in some ways.
Yes, it is.
It's incredibly niche market, at least, isn't it?
It is.
Which is such a shame because it ends. I remember Auden saying something like, "Unfortunately, you end up writing poetry books for people who write poetry."
Yes,
which he didn't want to do. He wanted to, Frost again, trying to write for every person, not people who are interested in poetry. But we seem to have lost. Poetry seems to have lost that big audience.
Yes.
I mean, Seamus had it, but very unusually.
He was very unusual, I think. Yes, yeah. And of course he said some very good things on this topic, didn't he? I mean, and he I'm not expressing it exactly as he did, but he says something like, that if you think poetry is the most important thing in the world, you won't write very good poetry, really. You must recognise there are the things that are more important than poetry. I mean, broadly speaking, the political world, I suppose, is a larger thing and more important. And he also says, that he thinks the thing that lets him keep his balance with poetry is the fact that he comes of a kind of an agricultural line of country people who didn't think poetry was the most important thing in the world. That was an important kind of qualification. So and that's linked to it in some ways. I mean, I think that getting back to poetry that is kind of intelligible and being serious about the world is.
I think I even remember you writing about Wilfred Owen saying something.
Yes.
Something about the poetry. I can't quite remember what he said. Something about the poetry is not what matters, or something.
Yeah. That's Owen said that himself at the end, didn't he? That the poetry is not what matters. It's what the poetry is doing, what it says, really. Are there current poets maybe who do that? I mean, the niche market idea. Are there people? Heaney was clearly someone who did kind of transcend that.
Yes, very much so. Somebody
like Yeats is this nearly earlier work, but I mean he's an interesting example because I mean Yeats has got some pretty funny ideas. He talks a lot of nonsense. He's silly as Auden said. But Auden also said, "You were silly like us, but
that's right.
Your silliness, your kind of gift, kind of transcended all that." So.
So how what would you say? If you say someone who was trying to read poetry, how would you encourage? What would you say was the value of it?
Yes. I think maybe writing poetry, you're attempting to say something in a different kind of different sort of register, different language or something, I mean, for instance, I said before that I thought poetry should be political, but I mean, clearly the best discussions of politics are by political journalists, They're the authorities, they're the specialists, on politics. So poetry isn't the primary way of doing that. It's the Emily Dickinson thing about telling it slant, There's that. I mean, so that you're talking about reality and important and serious things, but at an angle to. I may have said this before as well, but I was taught a long time ago by a wise student called Wallace Robson. He said there are some things that are always false.
Always false.
He said, for example, if somebody says the buggers should be shot, he said that's always false. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's not saying anything. And poetry is kind of the opposite of that. It's using words in a kind of weighted and kind of intended way,
which somehow wants to unify the intimate and particular with the universal in a way that politics can't do.
Yes.
It wants, like your poetry speaks very much from a particular voice, but tries to echo out into. I mean, I was remembering Frost saying, "Why not have it imply everything?"
Yes.
It's that intention, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is. It's unusual. Yes.
And difficult to pull off.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.